Hello everyone, I'm Benjamin Yoder with One Controller Report, here today to talk to you about Last Rebellion. This is a PlayStation 3 RPG by NIS and Hitmaker, and it maybe doesn't have the greatest reputation. I believe this game has like a 44 out of 100 on Metacritic. It's pretty infamous that the NIS America president apologized for releasing this game in the US, saying this game did not meet the quality standards of games they should be localizing. And it also was the last game Hitmaker put out before they filed bankruptcy. So there's not a lot of good feelings around this game when you just look at it on like the wiki and everything. So, you know, financial woes aside from Hitmaker, I do think this game might have gotten it a bit too hard on the critic side. It's definitely not a great JRPG, but it has some fun ideas that it tries to implement, and to some extent, doesn't do a great job of it through, poor execution or just not like explaining mechanics to the player. But if you do get the chance to kind of interact with those mechanics, it does offer quite a bit of entertainment because it is pretty different from a lot of other games. The most obvious difference here is that the turn-based battle system has this kind of body part system. So essentially what happens is each enemy has a series of body parts, and you can attack those body parts in different orders to find a weakness. And essentially each enemy has a different set of body parts, or a different order of body parts you attack to do the most damage to them. The big thing is that every single enemy in the game is this way, and I think something that I ran into that I wonder if a lot of other people run into too, is that there is not a great explanation of the best way to find out how these body parts should be found. It's very tempting to just basically poke away the enemy one stab at a time to find out what the order is for this body part damage, but that takes forever, and it actually makes the game very challenging because you are taking a lot of damage, and early on especially, you have pretty limited resources when it comes to magic, health, and something called CP, which essentially is your action points. So don't do that. Don't sit there and just like poke at an enemy one bit at a time. I'll go ahead and offer you some advice here. Just randomly hit body parts. And the reason why, and I don't know if the game ever explains this to you because I don't recall ever seeing it, is as you hit different body parts on an enemy, you get a random chance that you will learn where that body part is in the sequence of attacks, essentially. So you'll get you'll find out that the left arm for the enemy is the third thing you should hit, and then you can start using some pattern recognition to kind of puzzle out what order you should be attacking the other body part. So something that's fairly common is that attacking the left limb always comes before attacking the right limb. So you can say if the left hand is a 3, then that means the right hand is a 4. So as you learn more and more of what each of these slots are in terms of the order, you can kind of puzzle out what the rest of the attack sequence is. Unfortunately, the user interface for this is pretty cumbersome. You can attack the different body parts on each individual enemy, but that means basically, if there's 5 enemies on screen and they all have 10 different body parts, you're going to be essentially assigning 50 commands. You do have the ability to essentially store a set of actions you've assigned. So if you're attacking 5 of the same enemy, you can kind of sit there and copy and paste between them depending on what you know. But when it comes to like editing those, if you want to try different things against the different enemies to kind of learn more about the attack damage, or if there's just things where you want to hit the random body parts, but you also want to hit them in different times to kind of try to see if you can get lucky and learn more about the order of which you should be attacking them as well. The game doesn't really do a great job of giving you the tools to quickly assign that. There is one that basically attacks every single body part on an enemy, but it always is in the same order every time, so you're basically committing to, I'm only going to use random chance to try to learn more about this enemy. And it doesn't help that there are a lot of reskins of enemies in this game, even within the same areas. So sometimes you'll approach an enemy and you'll think that it's one that you've already learned all about, so it's going to be a fast encounter because you can just smack them, get them dead, and then move on. But then you find out they're actually slightly bigger than what that enemy typically is in terms of their size, and now they have a completely different attack chart. But if you do encounter the same enemy, it will memorize what you've learned about that enemy. So you can kind of, carry over progress between battles. But by the time you go to the next area, usually that enemy is kind of obsolete at that point. So even if you learn like every single attack pattern on an enemy within a zone, it feels kind of like it's useless information that you're just kind of throwing away. It would have been nice if like particular types of enemies or particular races of enemies had an order, and that order would remain the same throughout the game. But yeah, it just asks for you to do a lot for mostly pretty minimal reward when it comes to normal enemies. Although for bosses, it's definitely worth learning out, especially in the more challenging ones. But even though it's maybe not the smartest thing to kind of go out of your way to learn the different orders of which you need to attack enemies, there's something weirdly addictive about it as you see all the numbers fill in. And it's really fun to see just like how much damage you can start doing, especially if you're able to learn the enemy's magical weakness as well. There's an extensive magic system here that actually kind of interlocks with that whole body part system. Essentially, as you hit those different body parts, you stamp them, and then you can cast spells to all the body parts that have been stamped. So if you hit all 9 body parts at a single enemy, you can essentially cast an ice spell on all 9 of their body parts. And there's a lot of magic in this game, and you obtain them through locked chests, weirdly enough. You kind of go around with these keys and just kind of open these chests and get spells. It's kind of a bizarre thing, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. What really is challenging with the magic system is that usually an enemy seems to have like one weakness, but there are a exorbitant number of spells. So just trying to find an enemy's weakness takes a lot of time, and it also takes a lot of magic points. And especially early on, those magic points are pretty precious. So it really kind of discouraged me from spending much time using the magic system, because the majority of spells would do less damage to most enemies unless you find their particular weakness. And there's no real way to discover that weakness outside of just casting your entire list of spells and seeing what they're weak against. There are some hints throughout the overworld that I found about some particular types of enemy, like orcs are weak against iron axes or something, but it was never something that was common enough to really alleviate the issue. And what ultimately would end up happening is, if my melee attacks were doing enough damage to get through an encounter, I would just focus on melee attacks and completely ignore the magic system, because it just was too much effort to try to find each enemy's weakness. There is one other gimmick that I think is worth noting, but doesn't really amount to much, and that's the fact that there's essentially 2 characters in this game, and they occupy the same body, so they actually switch between who is physically present in the world. And in concept, this is a cool idea. They basically have the ability to act on their own, and each of them has a particular types of like absorb or sealing spell for recovering MP and HP, but it really doesn't amount to much, and the characters share the same resource, so they share the same MP pool, same HP, same action points, as well as status ailments. So it kind of limits what you can do with them, because you're really doing is getting extra actions from them. You're not really being able to, buff a character one way on one character and then buff the character another way on another character. And then things like, if you get stunned, it basically means your entire party's stunned for multiple turns. It's a little frustrating in that regard. But I think this is a neat idea that ultimately doesn't really amount to much. There is some MP and HP recovery stuff when you're navigating the overworld. They have like a latent recovery that they have, so you might switch between which one you're running around the world with. But as your stats get higher in the game, the very slow recovery rate of the MP and HP that they have just isn't worth it. So at some point, you just kind of don't really pay attention to what character's doing what. You just make sure you're using like their complete set of action points. Now, the world is actually pretty fun to explore. I feel like it's, maybe this is me being an old man. I've kind of gotten a little frustrated with open world games in general, having not played that many, but the ones I have played, I've been like, I'm not a huge fan. And this game does generally have a linear progression, so you're not really going to be exploring a bunch of different areas, and a lot of areas are just like straight paths that connect from one zone to the next. But there are little environments you can explore that have like branching paths on them and things like that. There are some barriers set up to kind of prevent you from going too far out of range. Although there's definitely times that I feel like the story doesn't really do a good job of conveying where you should be going next or what the next objective is. And it can be a little frustrating trying to figure out which of those branching paths you should go down to find the one barrier you're able to open now, as opposed to another barrier that you still don't have the right item to open. and the map is not particularly expansive, so when you're getting story points that are kind of talking about where you should be going next, it can be a little hard to identify exactly where that is because you can't really just like pull up a map and see where you should be going next. Thankfully, there is a fast travel system here, so it's very easy to kind of jump around the world and find where you need to be going. It just would have been nice if there's a more one-stop shop kind of place to figure out your next route. The story itself is kind of whatever. It's worth noting I streamed this game, so when it comes to streaming games, it's a lot harder to pay attention to story. I will not say this game has an amazing story. Basically, like I said earlier, these two characters are kind of trapped in a body together, so a lot of it is them kind of learning to get along, learning more about each other, and the two different kind of worlds they're from in terms of, one being a kind of like this fighter type character who was under a king, and the other one being I guess you could call it like in a churchish kind of way, like a sealer who kind of seals the dead and also has the power to like heal people. And the overarching story is about some god of death and life. I think they're warring, and there's like some necromancer going around reviving the dead. It really doesn't matter, personally, in my opinion. Like I said, I was streaming it, so maybe I just didn't really get the full grasp of the story, but nothing really stood out to me. And there's also some story points that never really feel fully explained and are just kind of like briefly touched on. The ending specifically is kind of whatever. I was kind of surprised by the ending. It just feels like it kind of shows up and then it's kind of there. Although that may have been somewhat intentional. So the male main character in this game, a guy named Nine, I like him a lot because he just like kind of doesn't care the entire game, to the detriment of the story probably, because basically he has no investment in anything and just like makes like just kind of weird remarks the entire game, weird humorous remarks. So it's like pretty funny to just hear him like talk. I mean, he definitely gets a bit more serious towards the end, and he builds a relationship with Aisha, the girl he's bound to. But even by the time you get to the end and like the final plan of what the enemy was looking to do and laid out in front of him, he more or less just has a response that's kind of like, all right, why do I have to deal with this kind of thing? He's a fun character, but maybe doesn't lead to like a satisfying story. But if you do play this game and you do like entertaining kind of goofy assholes, a 9 will definitely fulfill that niche for you. The storytelling does feel a bit cheap. It uses a lot of static 2D art, but it looks pretty nice. And there's also like these guest artwork that appears on the loading screens in the game too that actually look really nice too. I don't think I ever thought I would talk about loading screen art in a review at any point. But generally, I think the aesthetics of the game are pretty solid. Like, this is a PS2 looking game that has a higher polygon count because it's on a PlayStation 3 basically. The soundtrack is actually really interesting, maybe not very fitting for the game. It's this really foreboding and atmospheric background music in a way that feels very almost like Devil May Cry 1 or like survival horror-ish in some ways. It feels a little out of place, but I do really, really like it. So ultimately, I think this game, like I've said, it has some really neat mechanics that it's trying to do things with, but the implementation I think is just flawed, and if you don't approach the game in a very particular way, I feel like it actually hurts that experience quite a bit more significantly. But it's a short game, it's like 15 hours long, so if you want to see like a shorter JRPG that's really rough, weird, and has an entertaining protagonist, I think it's definitely worth a look, and probably better than the 4 out of 10 Metacritic gives this game. But again, maybe I would hesitate to say this is a good JRPG. Anyways, that's it for this week. Thanks for coming. OneControllerPort.com is the website. I recently did a review on The Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road, so I'll go ahead and link that here at the end of this video, as well as a review on Shining Resonance Refrain for the PlayStation 4. So if you're interested in some JRPG content, there are 2 things there. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. Bye!